So I think I always had this fear that I would one day turn into my mom.
Welcome to the Crucible Project Podcast. The Crucible Project is a nonprofit organization committed to creating a world of men and women who live with integrity, grace, and courage, helping them to fulfill their God-given purpose. This podcast will discuss important and sometimes difficult topics while delivering practical life applications with men and women who are currently practicing this work. We are igniting Christ-like change in men and women through experiences of radical honesty and grace.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Crucible Project Podcast. My name is Andy Spell, and I'm one of the interviewers, and we are so excited that you've joined us today for this interview. And today I am interviewing Brittany Duke. I'm really excited to interview her and for you to hear her story. I believe that when we tell our stories, that there is a connection that we have to everyone else's story. And I believe that will happen today. I believe you will get a nugget from what she says about her journey in soul work and the Crucible Project. So if you don't know this, Crucible Project has men's and women's weekends. And so we do have things for men and women. It changed my life. I believe it'll change your life. And I'm excited for you to hear today how it has helped Brittany in her world. So Brittany, welcome.
Hi, Andy. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, man, I'm excited to have this conversation. So, Brittany, would you please tell us just a little bit about who you are, what you do, and just some things we need to know about you this morning?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I am a wife and a mother. My husband and I are raising 3 kiddos in Tomball, Texas, which is a little suburb right outside of Houston. And I have the privilege of being on staff at the Crucible Project. So I get to be in this work and with people that live out this work daily, and that's a huge blessing.
Yeah, that's awesome. You do a great job, by the way. So thank you for the work you do for Crucible. So as we get into this, I want to start off just kind of right off the bat with what led you to decide to go to a Crucible weekend?
Yeah, so I got, I call it like baby step introduced to the Crucible Project. I worked on a church staff a few years ago, and our lead pastor went through a weekend. And many of the men in our church also went, and you could see the difference in them when they came back. And our lead pastor instituted some things on staff, like check-ins and accountability, and just some things that gave me a little taste of it. And then my husband eventually went through a weekend, and I got to see how he came back after just 3 days. And I'll be honest, I was skeptical. But he came back after 3 days, and like he looked different. He spoke different. And it just really was a big change in him. And when they started women's work and I heard about it, it was just something that that I felt called to do. Honestly, hesitantly. I had done some counseling stuff before to go through kind of my childhood trauma. And, I'd worked in ministry, and it was one of those things of like, well, I'm not an addict. I'm not, in a rock bottom place of my life. Like, do I really need it? I wasn't so sold on that part of it, but went just because I had seen it do good for others, and was just pleasantly surprised of kind of like, I didn't know what I was missing until I found it. And I got that kind of perspective after the weekend.
Yeah. So you just kind of went in, not really knowing what to expect, just saying, maybe this will be good for me for a weekend.
Yeah. And it was at a time, I will say the other part that encouraged me was I had just come to work on staff at the Crucible Project in the operations side, behind the scenes stuff. And I was encouraged that for me to understand the culture of the ministry, I needed to go on a weekend. And I'm not sure without that requirement if I would have invested the time in myself to have that experience, especially at the season of life I was in. I had, at the time, my youngest was just 1 year old, still nursing, and to leave for a weekend and leave all 3 kiddos home with my husband for the first time that was a big step. So I think the Lord knew the exact encouragement that I needed to go, and that was to make it a requirement of my job.
Yeah, so you invested in yourself. That's awesome. And man, people out there listening, it is so important to invest in ourselves. More and more, that is not a selfish thing to do.
No,
So
absolutely. And especially I think as mothers, we often get that conflict of mommy guilt when we try to take care of ourselves. And that guilt can be loud. And it's something that you got to battle. You got to take care of yourself, because honestly, in taking care of yourself, you are taking care of your kids and your husband, because you're giving them the best version of you.
thank you for that. So you got on the weekend. How did God show up for you on that weekend? What was revealed to you that you were not aware of? And how did God make it plain to you? Maybe even how did God minister to you on that weekend?
Yeah, so I came up in a traumatic childhood, and I knew that going in, and I had done some Christian counseling and therapy around, how that trauma affected me and kind of my worldview and what I thought of other people. But going on the weekend, it really flipped the script and helped me for the first time to see what those negative experiences in my life made me think of myself. I had never been really focused on that. I was more focused on how those experiences affected my outward behavior to others or how I perceived others. And the weekend really gave me a fresh perspective of what I was letting those experiences define of myself. And for the first time, starting to look at them, unpack them. And a lot of that came from hearing the stories of other women. It really opened up to things in my own story that I'd never looked at. But when I heard other women talking about how things affected them, it was this light bulb moment of, oh, I went through that. I wonder if I do that behavior or react that way because of that event. And it really did just change the way I saw everything, when I thought I already had it all figured out.
Yeah. So, and one of the things we talk about in Crucible is these messages we take on, and many times we don't realize it. They're many times unintentional that we got them. But what were some of those messages that you realized I've taken those on about myself?
Yeah, so the big one was just my self-worth. Because of the trauma I went through as a child, I lived with a single mother, after a nasty divorce, and she had a drug problem, an alcohol problem, and as it started to really just destroy her life, it started to destroy mine as well. And there were definitely things, when she was in the midst of her addiction, that she would say to me. And as a child, I would often feel like I would toughen up and be like, oh, she's just saying mean things to say them. And I never felt like they sunk in until I got on this weekend and started looking
Mm,
at things. And I realized, wow, I talk to myself internally the way my mother used to talk to me. And it
wow.
was this sense of, I'd almost never really heard it until the women leading that weekend walked me through it. And I described it then, I think it still fits, of like an elevator music effect of just this negative, nasty, mean voice. And I was so used to it being there so long, I almost didn't even notice it until it was silenced for just a moment. And then that silence was so uncomfortable because I'd never heard it before. There was just always these negative messages of, you're not good enough. Everything you do is wrong. You make everybody else's life more difficult on them. You're always in the way. All of those things, that it wasn't until I really took the time to be still and listen that I could hear them stop, and then realize just how paralyzing it had been for so long.
Yeah. So those messages, now that you are aware of them, and it's crazy how that happens. And folks out there, I think we all walk around with these kind of messages playing, and we don't know they're there. How did those messages up to the weekend, how did they affect the way you mothered, the way that you were a wife? How have they affected your relationships now that you could look back and go, oh my goodness, this is why I react this
Mhm.
way, or I do this, or I do that?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely made me, those messages led me to take on responsibility for things that weren't mine.
Hmm.
When my husband had a bad day at work and came home and wasn't feeling social or wasn't his bubbly self, that was my fault. He's in a bad mood because I'm not a good wife. When my kids threw a
Wow.
fit because I wouldn't give them a pack of cookies before dinner, that was my fault. They're throwing a fit because they don't have the mother they deserve. And that always, anytime you're blaming yourself for things, you'll react different. And I was blaming myself for everything. And so the reaction was very different. It almost felt like a combative of I've got to fix this because it's my fault. And if I don't fix it, then it's even more my fault. And this is just going to go on and on. And now I'm in their way. And now, I'm hurting them. Um, when now that I can look at things of, my husband's going to have bad days and it has nothing to do with me. Other people in his life affect him besides me.
Yeah.
And I can let him just have his bad day and go on with mine. And same thing with my kids. They're going to have bad days. They're not my fault. They're theirs. And, I can be there and help them through it. But that pressure for everyone to be happy and excited about everything all day, every day is not reality. And it's not mine to own and carry.
Yeah. And that weight is just enormous. And what would you say to any mom out there listening to this that is under that kind of weight right now, that the whole world's happiness and her family's happiness and their future and everything totally relies on her shoulders? What would you say to them?
Yeah, just that it's a lie, that it is a lie. And even the attempt to carry that weight, it will eventually destroy you. And that's not what's going to best serve your family. And I think moms and wives, we do have this servicehood built into us. We do want to nurture and take care of those around us that we love, and we can do that, but we have to find ways to do it for ourselves first. And that's going to help lead in to better serve those around you, is when you're taking care of yourself. And it's so easy to say and it's so hard to do. And it's something that even, when I was leaving for my weekend, my daughter at the time, I think she was about 3, and she just had a meltdown. It was my first time away from her, and it was so painful. And, I was calling friends on the way of, I just don't know, this isn't right. She's so upset. And my friends would just tell me, like, she's fine. Like, she's going to have the time of her life. She's going to have a weekend with dad that has completely different rules than you do. And yeah, she might miss brushing her teeth, but it's going to be okay. And just encouraged me. I think that's really important, is to have a group of friends, especially mom friends that can understand and tell you, like, yeah, like, that makes sense, you're feeling that way, but you don't have to. And just to remind yourself that, your kids are learning from you too. And the more that you can take care of yourself and show them that it's important to take care of yourself, the better off they're going to be when they're adults, because you've modeled that for them. And that's what I try to think of when it's hard and when that mom guilt kicks in loud, just to remind myself that I am teaching my sons that one day when they're married, they need to be big helpers so that their wife and the mother of their children can take care of herself. And I'm showing my daughter that it's important for her too, that to put aside the pressures of what you should be doing or what's more important, and instead focus on making sure that you're being your best self and that you're feeling love from yourself.
Man, that is so good. So you also talked about, and I remember this being so powerful for me on the weekend, you heard other women's stories. What was so powerful about that for you?
Oh, there's so many aspects of that were powerful. I think a big piece of it is I had walked through life with this false notion that everyone else's life is perfect and mine is a mess. And hearing those women's stories really tore down those lies of, especially, looking at a woman and you just judge them. Not necessarily negative, but I can see a woman and she looks put together, she looks kind, she treats others well. And it's just easy for me to say, oh, well, that's so easy for her because she's never gone through, the trash that I've gone through. And, she's never had these negative experiences to teach her not to trust people. So of course she's open and warm and kind. And then hearing their stories that are just full of pain and brokenness and going like, oh, that's probably not her natural way. She has probably had to work to trust people. She has probably had to work to let people in, and to just be able to say, if this woman that seems like she's got it all together could overcome everything she's done, then I can probably overcome some of my trash too. That was a big part of it, is just to understand that on a real level, that everybody has their own stuff, their own mess, their own brokenness. And there is a sense of camaraderie in that. And I think also it takes some of the stigma away for me, as far as, there were times in my life that I looked at the trauma I experienced as a punishment from God, and to then see other people, or other women especially, that I honor and respect and admire, and that they've gone through bad stuff too. It helps take that sense of, a mean God handing down punishments away. Another big piece of hearing their stories was just getting a perspective on my own, and hearing some of the trauma that other women have been put through, and know how close I was to having that be part of my story, and a sense of, wow, was God protecting me? And even when things felt really bad and really scary, they could have easily been so much worse, and just really being honored that God did protect me from certain aspects of abuse.
Yeah, man, that's huge. What did it do for your heart when you heard these women's stories?
It definitely gave me a new sense of empathy. I have struggled with female relationships most of my life, and then to hear women be so open, so vulnerable, in a way that, I mean, they were trying to care for themselves, but I also saw it as a way that they were caring for every woman in that room that they were sharing their story with. It just really opened up my heart to have more empathy, and to have a better perspective of, you never know anybody's whole story, and you never know what someone's
Yeah,
had to overcome, or how hard they've had to work to get to where they are, because those things, aren't written across your t-shirt. You really have to know somebody to get those stories. And I had not invested in friendships with women to get that kind of knowledge of what other women deal with and go through. I had really built a wall around myself, and having those vulnerable interactions on a weekend made me see that, man, it's worth getting to know women, and it is worth taking a risk of, they might hurt my feelings, they might not like something I have to say, but know that what's going to come out of that vulnerability in that relationship is extremely valuable.
how do you think your childhood wounds had put a wall or distance between you and other women? Why do you think your wounds had set your world up that way?
Man, it's just one of those things that I think the devil started using on me when I was real young. Most of my abuse came at the hands of my mother, which, should be the first woman in your life that you trust and get nurture from, is your mom. And I did not get that at all. And then I had experiences at school, although I never blatantly reached out and asked anybody to help me, or really disclosed what was going on at home. It was obvious. And even as a child, I had this inkling of like, these adult women in my life, they know this is wrong. Like, they know this isn't right, and they're not saying anything. Because, I would go to school, messy hair. We'd have water and electricity off for weeks at the time. Wrinkly, just dirty clothes, just really uncared for as a really young girl. Nobody ever stopped to ask, like, what's wrong, or do you need help, or let's talk to your mom. I never felt like anybody stepped in to try to rescue me, and a lot of that came from adult women, just because being a young girl, that's that's who I was surrounded by in the school system and things like that. We also did have CPS involved a few times, and it was always female interviewers that came to the house and they would check on things, and it was a wreck. Like, I don't have any memories of like my mom saying like, "Oh, somebody's coming to check the house. Let's clean up real quick," or "Let's do this." Like, it was always felt like a big surprise and a shock. So the house was always in shambles, and they would interview me in the midst of, beer cans and cigarettes everywhere. And it never felt like there was a reaction to that. It was like treated like, "Oh, this is fine for you." And, they would check on the minimal food being there, and, a roll of Ritz crackers and a can of tuna fish was enough. And they would say that, like, "Oh, yes, I can check this off. There's enough food." So it just built this sense in me of all of these females around me think this lack of care that I'm getting is enough for me. So that must be on me. That must be all I deserve, or all that is important for me. And it never felt like they did anything. So very early on, it just built this message in me that I'm on my own. No one's going to help. Like, I better figure this out, because I am the only one that's going to fight for me. Honestly, that was one of the things that through all the therapy and counseling that I was doing, it wasn't even touched until I went on that Crucible weekend.
Yeah, and I think part of that is, for me, when I went on my weekend, is I didn't even know how to touch that part. Like, that part seemed really scary, and maybe that's why I had it so put away, and almost a fear that if I really explore this, what will happen? Like, I don't know. I think our brains protect us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think maybe your mind was protecting you, and then all of a sudden there was a safe place to deal with these things. So true. I think many have experienced that. So we talked about, hearing other people's story. You're not alone. Other women had the same experiences you had. Or was there another way that God showed up for you that weekend, or ministered to you in a way that you needed?
Yeah. So I think I always had this fear that I would one day turn into my mom. And yes, the fears of addiction and what that does genetically, and it passes down through generations of family. Like, I've been aware of that, and I felt like protected myself from that. I've always been very careful around anything that I felt like could become an addiction. But I never really focused on, like, I was afraid of not having her addiction, but of having her personality, and having her temperament and the way she treated people. And I had not really focused on how that affected my choices daily. And that was something that going on the weekend really pointed out to me of, it really assured me actually that I'm not her. Like, and if I was, like, I'd already be her. I'm getting older and older, and I have done, and this is still hard for me to say because it feels like bragging, but it's not bragging on me, it's bragging on God. But I have so many things in my life that she never had, from relationships to community to just a healthy relationship with the Lord. And going on that weekend really assured me of, hey, stop trying to fight this battle that's not even there, because that's what I was doing for a long time. Like, oh, even like maybe not taking the trash out on time. To me, I would turn that into as, oh, my kids are living in squalor. I'm treating them just like my mom treated me. Like, no, like, the trash can's just a little full. But I would take everything to just this massive dramatic scale and talk badly to myself. You're just like her, when I've never been anything like her. And that weekend and that time with those other women really gave me permission of, I don't have to be perfect. And even when I don't reach perfection, I'm still doing way better for myself and for my family than my mother ever did for me. And that is a win.
And how did it feel to get to celebrate that finally and put that away?
Man, I'm not going to lie. It was really uncomfortable. I still really struggle. Well, even answering that question, I had to give an explanation. I'm not bragging, but God's done some great things in my
And it's
life.
okay to
It
brag, by the
is.
way. It's
It
so,
is. And
yeah.
when we beat like the chains of trauma and defeat, we should celebrate them. But that was something that is still, I can barely explain it. And I do say that's why if you see somebody go on a weekend and they come home and like their posture is different, like it really is a physical change in the way a man or a woman carries themselves after a weekend. And it's like this invisible weight was lifted. And I experienced a lot of that when I finally got to a point to celebrate what God's done in my life and how he's led me to care for myself and to be a better just a woman in general. Of like it really is just a weight lifted that you can feel in your back and in your neck, and it's just an incredible sense of not knowing what you needed and until you got it, and that's really how I experienced it.
Yeah. So one of the things you talked about was the way that you looked at other women and they all seemed to have it together, and they wouldn't understand, or, wow, they look so put together. Did you ever realize that that's how probably some people looked at you? And that they had no clue what your story was because you'd worked so hard to cover up that story. You weren't going to be a young woman who grew up in squalor and abuse with an addictive mom. Like, you worked so very hard to hide your story. Did it ever dawn on you that, man, I'm actually putting across the persona that everything's okay as
Yeah,
well?
it did, and I knew that because I worked very hard, especially in adolescence, right? When I feel like the pinnacle of being
Yeah.
judged is the highest it ever is. And
Yes.
when I
Yes.
got to actually in junior high, I came to live with my dad and my stepmom, and my life drastically changed overnight. I went from government housing and squalor to a middle class home and in a really an upper middle class area, and went to a much nicer school and things like that. And it was very early on of like, I've got to pretend I fit in here, and I did that pretty well. And it was one of those things that I didn't realize how doing that myself could affect those around me. I think it was just part of my survival mode for a long time. And like I
Mm-hmm.
just never turned it
Yeah.
off. That was another big thing I got out of the weekend, was realizing, I've physically been out of this abusive situation for 20 plus years, and I have not turned my survival mode off. Like, I am still living like I am in this war zone and I'm not anymore. And a big part of that was pretending everything was okay and fitting in and giving that impression that nothing bad has ever happened in my life. Because I would never invite something bad into my life, because somehow that's on me. If bad things happen to me, it's my fault. And really being able to hear other women help me to tear down that lie, and then the realization that me taking off that masks and being vulnerable with my story and letting people know that, yeah, I had to overcome some garbage to get here. It doesn't just help me, but it helps those around me too. And it just removes the stigma of, hey, bad things do happen to good people. And just because that bad thing happened to you doesn't mean you're bad. And that
Right.
was something that I learned from those women. And now I try in a safe way to let other people know, like, yeah, man, good things can come out of some real mess and brokenness. And a lot of times it's good people.
Yeah, and that as a child of God who God knitted together and created, you deserved the good things. That wasn't on you. I mean, just I want people to hear that that's not on you that the bad things happen. And yet, what's really scary is I think when we as people experience trauma in our childhood or in our teens, I think the enemy works so
Yeah, it
hard to
does.
say this was on you and it was your fault. And we give a pass, at least I did. I really gave a pass to the
Yeah.
abuser. Like, I let them off the hook for some reason. So man, that's good. I had interviewed Kenny Cox the other day, and I'm not going to get it right, and I should have written it down, but he said something about embracing our past and accepting it will help us to grow in our leadership and our ability to change the world. I know some of that, the pain and the trauma and the things you've talked about were very painful. How has embracing your past and realizing it wasn't your fault, but embracing your past, how has it motivated you and helped you to be a better person, a better mom, a better wife, a better church member, a better leader? How has embracing that helped you grow? And how's it made you a different person since the weekend?
Yeah, it is definitely, as I've taken the blame off of myself for the abuse that was put on me, it has helped me see other people differently. I think for a long time, I took that self blame of myself and put it on other people too. The same thing. If they'd been through some heavy things in their life, I thought, well, it's probably because you made some bad choices. And
Yeah.
I did that because that's how I thought of myself. And once I could take that off of myself, it helped me to see other people in just a different light. I think more of a child of God light of, hey, we all make bad choices. Sometimes it brings on consequences. Sometimes bad things just happen because they just happen. And it really helped me to see people with more loving and understanding eyes rather than a judgmental. It has helped me to trust people a lot more, to know that, just because somebody has a story doesn't mean that, they're a manipulative, mean person, or anything is wrong with them. It's just their story. I have also seen several instances where I can see myself stepping into something that I know if I didn't have the story I have, I could not properly step into this. And so I do see it as an act of service for people that I know and love, that when they're going through hard things, I can legitimately say, I know what it feels like,
Mm,
and give them some encouragement that, there is light at the end of the tunnel, and it is all with God's purpose, and he can work the nastiest things for good. I've learned that in a big way with my oldest son. He's technically my stepson. I don't like that phrase, but that's the one that people understand best. And we've had some difficult times in court trying to keep him safe, and with CPS trying to keep him safe. And there's been times that it drug up a lot of nasty things from my childhood and a lot of pain that I had tried to ignore or look at as data and not really tie to emotion. And it has forced me to do that. And I hate that those are the cards he's been dealt. But my experiences in that are really valuable in helping him walk through that. And it's one of those things that God, knowing that he was going to trust me with this child who I did not bear, I would go through my childhood 10 times over if it was going to help me help him one day. And that's scary
yeah.
to think about, but I do think that God works things like that. And I'd be happy to go through it all over again, knowing that I could one day support him in a more personal way.
Yeah. It's funny, Genesis 50, at the end of Joseph's life, Joseph gets to declare what you intended for evil, God intended for good, for the saving of many lives. And people listening, and I want people to hear this when I say that. I'm not glad in my life that the things happened to me that did, but now I can see them in light that has shaped me into the man that I am. And how beautiful that you can look back, and the enemy tried to
Yeah.
take you out. The enemy tried to do things to destroy you, to take you out, and use some people that should have protected you to do that. And that is painful. And that may be one of the worst hurts out there, is when family is in that. But the enemy tried to take you out, and yet you've turned it and said, no, I'm going to save lives. The things you try to do, I'm going to use those to save lives around me. And how beautiful that you can use that to minister to your
Hmm.
own son in your family. That's a beautiful thing. Any other ways that you feel like you have changed since the weekend and how your life has been different since then?
I think so. My husband said this after his weekend, and I didn't understand it till I went through it on my own. Of, this 3-day experience is not going to fix everything in your life. Keith said it's like seeing the weekend is seeing the cobweb in the corner of it's been there for a long time. You just haven't noticed it, and the weekend makes you notice it. And then it's like once you know it's there, you can't ignore it anymore. And that was a big thing that I got out of the weekend too, of it just shined a light on things that I had packed away so deep or ignored or didn't want to admit affected me. And it just put this light on them that I can't ignore them any longer. And it still surprises me how far that cobweb can go. Of I will still, let's see, it's been 4 years since I did my weekend, and there are still things that I will have a reaction to. And like in my mind, it goes, well, that didn't seem like an even reaction or an appropriate reaction to this little thing. Like you had a big reaction to this very little thing. And I can look back and go, oh, I bet this is connected to that. And there's still new things that come up of, I wonder how long I have been doing that because of this. And that's something that the experience continues to gift me of all these little things that happen that I don't like, or I wish I would have said something different. And I can tie it back to figure out, well, why did I say it that way? And it's just such a deeper understanding of myself. And after the weekend, it comes from more of a place of healing and improvement, where before it came from a place of judgment and just,
Yeah.
that mean voice back to myself of, how dare you say that? Like, and now it's just that light on, yeah, part of this is the way God made me, but part of it is the way that these experiences shaped me. And I don't want to change who God made me to be, but I can change how I allow those experiences to control me. And I just continue to see new ways to do that and new things that, oh, I didn't know I did that. So it's just a gift of that self-study and learning and healing and finding new things. I didn't even know that there was a wound there, and oh, that probably needs some attention.
So it sounds like you've learned to give yourself mercy and grace.
Bits. That's probably been the hardest one for me. I am getting there. I am extremely blessed to be surrounded by now men and women who've done this work, that when I slip in that area, they are quick to say, you're not being very merciful with yourself. Would you treat me that
Mm.
way? And I say, well, absolutely not. And well, don't treat yourself that way. So yeah, that is a place of I am still growing in, and I am so glad to have people around me that hold me to it, and call me to be better and to treat myself better, because I still need that encouragement.
Yeah, I did my weekend in 2010, so this is 12 years, coming up on 13 years of doing this work. And what I realized is soul work, I'm
Yeah,
never going to be
that's a
finished.
hard realization.
It is that every week, or maybe not week, but man, there are times I'm like, oh, I got to
Hmm.
work on that. Oh, that's a pain, or that's a hurt, or that's, yeah. And they're still out there, and it's just unpacking life and peeling the onion
Yeah,
back.
absolutely. Yeah, that's a hard one for me too, even going into the weekend, because I had done, therapy and counseling. I really thought like, well, I've cleaned all this up. I've dealt with all of this. I've done my trauma studies and all of this stuff. Like I'm kind of over it. Like I'm done working on this. And I even went into the weekend saying like, well, here's some real messy stuff in my life, but I want to work on something different. And they were like, that's not how it works. And I still have days I'm very disappointed that I am still working on this thing. But it is, man, it's a lifelong journey, and it's a hard realization for me of like I'm never going to be able to check that off a list. Like until the
Yeah.
good Lord calls me home, I am going to have to work at these things. And there's days that seems
Yeah.
overwhelming and exhausting, and there's other days it's like, hey, I'm still growing and I'm still getting better, and it's encouraging. But on those days that it feels like, man, I just don't want to do it anymore, those are the days when I need my people.
Yeah, absolutely. So is there anything else before we finish today? Is there anything else that you would like to share with us that's on your heart that you would want to say to somebody, to a mom out there, to a woman out there? She doesn't even have to be a mom, but to a woman or a man out there that you'd want to say to them about your experience and why you think doing this kind of soul work is important for every
I
person.
do think that it is important for every person. I think there is a common falsehood that if you haven't had these big traumatic things in your life, if you haven't had this, big abusive situation in your life, that you don't need this. And that's not true. Everybody has something to gain from this kind of soul work experience. And just the encouragement that, the day you leave, it feels like a gigantic investment. And the day you come home, it feels like a blip in time. And
Mm,
it's one of those situations that the juice is definitely worth the squeeze. And that
yeah.
that feeling changes so drastically in 3 days. And just the encouragement of going is going to feel uncomfortable. But I promise once you get there, it will all be worth it. And it will be incredibly worth it to you, your family, and generations to come when you come home and you instill what you learn in your life. It just has a ripple effect on everyone around you. And I just hope you would take the time and take the journey.
Yeah, awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much for being here today. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Andy.
Have a great day. And all of you out there in listening land, have an awesome day as well.
For more information about our weekends, please go to thecrucibleproject.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Rate and review wherever you are listening and subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. Also, don't forget to check out myjourney2.com for your free 2-week trial. That's myjourneyto.com. Thank you for listening.